So this is a talk that I gave at Galway City Museum on the 31st of May 2025, and in it I discussed the origin of the Gael as revealed by their DNA. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a scientist. I have a technician's diploma in applied science with distinction in chemistry in Dublin. I then got an honours degree, first class in biotechnology from the University of West of Scotland. I have a Ph.D. in autoimmune neuropathies from Glasgow Caledonian University. I did a postdoc in the University of Dundee in Scotland, and then a postdoc I was then later a senior scientist at the University of Galway between 2004 and 2010. And I started this journey with the creation of Irish Origins in 2010. Now, I'm not affiliated with any DNA testing company or university. And this research that I detailed here is fully funded by myself. There are no contributions from any other source. And today, well, this is basically a professional service. I run the Irish Origins, Scottish Origins, English Origins, and Origins Maps websites. And I work day to day with commercial DNA test results. And if you want a free consultation, then you just simply email me or contact me via one of the websites. Now, during this talk, I will explain how I generated a male Y-DNA map of Ireland and Scotland. I will explain how I identified the DNA signature of the Gael. Not every male in Ireland or Scotland is genetically a Gael, or even males with Irish or Scottish ancestry are genetically Gaels. I will explain where the Gaels come from and who they were as revealed by their DNA, and I'll compare the origin of the Gael as revealed by their DNA with their origin story and the description of themselves, some of which is detailed in the first floor of the Galway Museum. And at the end of the talk, in the interest of balance, I'll talk about the females. So generating a male Y-DNA map of Ireland and Scotland. So first you need to take a commercial ancestral Y-DNA test, which explores markers known as STRs or mutations known as SNPs on the male Y chromosome, which is only passed from father to son through the generations. Basically, the more markers or mutations two males share, the more recent their shared paternal ancestor once lived. And now to pinpoint a paternal origin, I exploit the link between the Y chromosome, surname, and land, which typically, in the past, passed paternally. Now, the surnames of the males revealed upon a Y-DNA test are in fact a snapshot of the surnames that arose among a tribal group of related males living in a specific location and a specific time point. And the great thing is that in Ireland and Scotland, farmers with each surname still concentrate in or near the area where their surname first appeared. So what do Y-DNA results look like? So this is Brendan McGowan. This is his Y-DNA 111 marker results. Brendan works here at the museum. Now, so what do you get with these results? Basically, you just get the names of the individuals with whom you share a common male ancestor. And this is the surnames, the last name of all those individuals. And you get a little bit of data on them, like the genetic distance, which merely details the degree to which you match these males. Now, these results are not random. So if you look at the surnames of these males, we see lots of McGuinnesses and lots of O'Donnells. Now, unfortunately, Brendan's Y-DNA SNP results, looking at those specific markers, have not yet arrived. But it turns out that Brendan is a close Y-DNA match to David Lee McGuinness, who is a previous customer of mine from 2015. Now, I pinpointed David's origin to County Derry in Northern Ireland, and what he subsequently did was he recruited Patrick McGuinness from Derry, who lives there, for a commercial Y-DNA test, and they were a match. And that pinpointed origin within Derry was confirmed by that Y-DNA match. So, and David and Patrick have both extensively Y-DNA SNP tested. So what you see here are David McGuinness's closest Y-DNA STR revealed surname matches. Now, the figures in brackets for each surname, you see here, that's basically the number of males with each surname that appear as a match to David McGuinness throughout his 111, 67, and 27 marker matches. Okay, and what you see here is a mix of surnames that are of Irish and Scottish origin, but it's the Irish surnames that dominate in closeness and frequency, and particularly in closeness and frequency are the O'Donnell and McGonigal surnames. So if you look at where McGuinness, McGowan, O'Donnell and McGonigal, where those surnames occur in closest proximity to one another, it's in Northwest Ireland, right up there near the McGuinnesses in Northwest Ireland in Derry, where we have a pinpointed origin for these McGuinnesses. So basically the McGowan, the McGuinness, the McGonigal and the O'Donnell surnames have arisen among a tribal group of related males living in the Donegal and Derry borderlands. And that's the time frame is approximately 1,000 years ago. Surnames first appear in Ireland. Now, if you look at the medieval surnames of the Derry, Donegal, and Tyrone borderlands, as it appears on this origins maps, you can see that there's two groups of McGowans close to the McGuinnesses, but those McGowans basically are, there's a big gap, basically, a big empty space between those McGowans. So that's a bit odd, but it makes sense actually if you think about the history, because what you have is, if you look at the plantation surnames of the Derry, Donegal, and Tyrone borderlands, you see that that is an area that was successfully planted by a bunch of Scots and some English in around 1600 AD. So basically what you have happened is that Brendan McGowan's, his McGowan ancestors were basically displaced and scattered to the north and south of their original homeland, a direct consequence of the plantation of Ulster. So Ireland has a wealth of place names, including townlands, that are references to clans and families that are associated with a location. And what I can do is I can look at those townlands and place names to see if there are any that are references to the McGowans of the Northwest. And if we look at the surrounding townlands, we find right in between the two bunch of McGowans, who we know have been scattered as a result of the plantation of Ulster, we see Ballymcgowan. And Ballymcgowan literally means McGowan's town. So Ballymcgowan, or McGowan's town, is basically ground zero for Brendan's paternal line. It's where his direct male ancestor lived when surnames became common approximately 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, his ancestor became McGowan. But his genetic relative down the road, he became McGuinness. The other guy up to the north or west, they became O'Donnell, or they became McGonigal, or they became Duffy. And what's interesting is, although Ballymcgowan is today part of the modern city of Derry, if you look at the street level, you can see the actual street level on the street signs that their association has now been incorporated into the street names. So this is Ballymcgowan Avenue in Londonderry, Derry. So this is going back to David McGuinness's Y-DNA SNP matches. As I say, still waiting on Brendan McGowan's Y-DNA SNP results. But this is interesting because SNP testing, well, that really offers us a more accurate representation of the chronological development of surnames among a tribal group of related males. And what do I mean by that? Well, basically, if you look here, in this yellow box here, these are predominantly McGuinness males. So this is David's results. This is David here. This is Patrick, who we recruited from Derry, so we know these are Derry McGuinnesses. Basically, all these McGuinnesses who've tested, they all carry this marker, this Y-DNA mutation on the Y chromosome, which is RBY21159. That is a mutation that denotes the McGuinnesses of County Derry. Now, and what we know about these McGuinnesses is that they lived among a group of related Gaelic males, Irish males, who became Duffys, but also O'Donnells. So, but what about these guys called Leach? Genetically, they are McGuinness. What's happened? And there's a simple explanation. If we look at the plantation surnames that arrived here in 1610 AD, well, there's a bunch of Scottish surnames there. And if you look down here, so we know the McGuinnesses are up here, but if you look down here, there's Leach, Scottish Leach, Leitch, Leach today. Spelling of a surname typically changes, you move away. But what happened is that these guys, they were originally McGuinnesses, but they become Leach. But why? Well, probably during the turbulent 1640s. There's lots of orphans, and what's probably happened is that some McGuinness orphans have been adopted into a planter family called Leach, and they are brought up as Leach. Their descendants are Leach, but genetically, Y-DNA-wise, they are McGuinness. And this sort of non-paternal event that this is called, this is quite common in Ulster. Now, probably why Ulster DNA is quite fascinating. So here's the important part. So basically, I've shown you how I pinpoint an origin for each individual. I have their very specific SNP data. So for example, here is David McGuinness, who I mentioned, and this is his SNP mutation data here. So basically, I have pinpointed origins for hundreds of males with Irish or Scottish ancestry, and I know their SNP mutations. Each customer's Y-DNA SNP data can be aligned, and their relationships to each other can be determined. So each of these individuals here carry that M222 marker, same as Mr. McGuinness. And I can basically see where each individual branches off from one another. So rather than look at all that data on an Excel spreadsheet, this is how I represent all those individuals in a haplogroup tree. So these SNP alignments allow the construction of haplogroup trees, and Brendan McGowan and Dave McGuinness's paternal lines are on a branch of this RM222 haplogroup tree. So basically, this mutation here, this is Brendan McGowan's, very closely related to McGuinness's. He has his origin here, pinpointed origin. And if we look at some other customers, so basically each of these little blocks represents a mutation that can be linked with a location, and that's either in Ireland in green or Scotland blue. And if we look at some other customers, we include President Michael D. Higgins, President of Ireland, who has a pinpointed origin down here in Galway, and that's his branch there. This is Manco McGann, TV presenter, Gaelic Irish scholar, and his ancestors are linked to Cavan. And then there's Norman P. MacLelland. He's the Scottish representation of this group. He's an the late Norman P. MacLelland. His paternal ancestry pinpointed origin is in southwest Scotland. but his Irish links come via his Scots-Irish ancestors who settled in County Down and then went to the States and settled in Arizona, where Norman P. MacLelland built the MacLelland Irish Library in Phoenix, Arizona, which I highly recommend if you ever get the chance to visit. So, as I've showed you, this is Brendan's little branch down here, but his this haplogroup tree is a sort of little branch of an even larger tree here. So what you actually are seeing in this instance is, well, we're basically tracking Brendan's paternal ancestral journey over millennia. Because what you have is that on each of these little mutations, you have a location, and a location which we can track Brendan's ancestral journey. And what you see, this is basically it. This is Brendan's ancestral journey. His ancestral journey over millennia, which takes him from Ireland, where you see all. So Ireland, you see all the green little markers here, mutation locations. But then it goes into Scotland. So straight away we can see Brendan's ancestral journey has taken his ancestor from Britain from southern Britain into Scotland and then into Ireland. But those two haplogroup trees I showed you there, they're just a small part of what is the complete Y-DNA map, SNP map of Ireland and Scotland. And in my research, I found that there are 15 dominant Y-DNA haplogroups combined into 11 trees illustrated here that account for 99% of Irish and Scottish origins case studies. So if you're looking at this and you're a male and you have a Y-DNA origin within Ireland, then your ancestor, your place on this map will be one of these little blocks on one of these 11 haplogroup trees. And in fact, this little block down here, that's me. So my ancestral story, my journey, is quite different from Brendan's. And it's Brendan's story, the story of the Gael, which I'm going to illustrate in the next part. So you can put this into chronological order at the point at which each of these mutations arrive in Scotland and Ireland. So the very first of the Neolithic. And they bring their markers, their Y-DNA markers, most notably IP37 and IM223 in around 4500 BC. So these are the descendants of the first farmers. And they are followed by the earliest Indo-Europeans. The RL51 is the marker that denotes the earliest of the Indo-Europeans. And then there's a second wave of Indo-Europeans, and they carry RDF13. And this RDF13 appears to have first appeared in southern Britain and is carried into Scotland and then Ireland. And after those, you have the Romans, who bring in their particular markers, which are usually Mediterranean associated markers. And I can detect them in southern Scotland, which is an area that for about 150 years was occupied, colonized by the Romans. And then finally, in this story, we have the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, Viking, and Norman. I've left the Anglo-Saxon out of here because there's not much Anglo-Saxon DNA. It's hard to detect, but there is plenty of Viking DNA and Norman DNA. But there's far more Viking DNA in Scotland than in Ireland. And the reason for that is another story, which I'll deal with in a separate video. So, identifying the Y-DNA signature of the Gael. So as I showed in the previous slide, there's a lot of DNA mutations markers that are present in Scotland and Ireland, which of those Y DNA SNPs or mutations denote the Gael. Now the problem is I can't use Ireland to find DNA markers associated with the Gael, and that's because all of Ireland was Gaelic at one point. But I can use Scotland, because Scotland, not all of Scotland, was Gael. If you look at the surnames of Scotland map that I produced a number of years ago, and if you draw a line, a red line, this red line here, if you draw a line through the areas where you find max surnames, so this is the maximum area extent of Gaelic surnames in Scotland, you'll see that there's a perfect east-west divide. So only the west of Scotland was Gaelic. And that's not just in the surnames. If we look at place names, if you look at Gaelic place names in southwest Scotland, you'll see, well, basically they're all in the southwest. There's very few in the east. And that supports the fact that Gaelic west of Scotland. So what are the markers associated with the Gaelic west of Scotland? I can use this information now to find my Gaelic markers. And if you think about it, there's a shared language among the Scots and the Irish. There's shared mythology, shared surnames, begin with Mac. There's shared sport, hurling, shinty, alcohol, whiskey, dance, Gaelic. So it's logical to assume that because we share the history, there's also shared DNA, Y DNA. So if you are a potential customer of mine and you come to me with your Y DNA results, and it turns out that you have a Gaelic origin in Scotland, then you'll carry one of 3 Y DNA mutations, okay? And basically you'll fall into one of these 3 groups, 3 haplogroups or subgroups. And these 3 groups, so first off, we've already mentioned RM222. That's associated with Brendan and David McGuinness. So Brendan McGowan and David McGuinness, they carried this mutation. But there's also an IM223 subgroup called IS7753, and that's a Neolithic marker. And then you've also got another marker which is also Indo-European, like M222, and that's RL1065. But this is very much a sort of Highland Scottish Gaelic marker. So straight away you can see that, well, for a start, there is shared Y DNA signature among the Irish and Scottish Gaels. But it's a mix. The Gaels are not a homogeneous group. They actually consist of 2 distinct Indo-European markers plus a bit of Neolithic DNA as well. Now, there is only one area where these 3 Gaelic DNA markers occur together, and that's in southwest Scotland. So the origin of the Irish and Scottish Gaels emerged from southwest Scotland. So basically the common ancestors, Scots and Irish Gaels, emerged from this location. So in Ireland, the Gael RM222 and IM223 markers, they dominate the northern half of Ireland. So basically in Ireland, there is a clear north-south divide in the DNA of Ireland. It's Northern Gael and Southern, older Indo-European ancient Britain. So where did the Gaels come from? Well, they appear in southwest Scotland, but when did they come from? So when did the Gaels appear? Well, so this haplogroup tree here, so as I mentioned, these are all mutations that we can link to locations, but we also have a time frame because the DNA company can estimate when each mutation appears. So we have a time frame. Now, I should also mention that this excessive branching that you see here, these are all branches and the branches, more branches, that indicates that there's a population explosion. So something happens at a specific time point and these guys multiply, okay? They have lots of offspring, basically, lots of sons having lots of sons. So what's the time frame? Well, if you look at the time frame, it's post-Roman occupation of Scotland. So some point in the fourth, second century AD. And that's for the M222 for this haplogroup. If we look at the other Indo-European haplogroup of the Gaels, which is this here, L1065, again, that branching, that population explosion post-Roman occupation of Scotland. What about that third Neolithic marker? Well, this is that little branch down here. And again, it's this branching, this population explosion right after the Roman occupation of Scotland. So what you have is basically the Gaels. They fill the vacuum left by the Roman withdrawal behind Hadrian's Wall in around 180 AD. So the Gael population expands and then spreads throughout Scotland and the northern half of Ireland. Okay, so as I've mentioned, the Gaels are not a homogeneous group. Okay, they are made up of at least of three distinct Y-DNA markers. IM223, which is the Neolithic contribution. We have an Indo-European RM222 contribution, and we have this RL1065 Indo-European contribution. Now, interestingly, the land where they all appear together is called Galloway, which literally means land of the foreigners. Makes me think there's a bit of foreign contribution into this area. Now here's the enigma. So early Gaelic is similar to Gaulish. Gaulish is the language spoken by the Gauls that Julius Caesar was fighting in modern France. Okay. So how did the Gaels end up speaking a language whose nearest relative was continental Gaulish? And that's a quote taken from J.P. Mallory in a Razib Khan interview on YouTube. When we know that the Y-DNA makeup of Ireland and Scotland was essentially formed by 2500 BC, 1700 years before the first Gauls appear on the continent. So why did they not speak something related to modern Welsh, which is a Bronze Age language? And that's a quote from David Starkey. So as I mentioned, there's evidence for foreign input because Gael, very similar, which means Gael, which means foreigner in Gaelic, is very similar to Gael and Gaul. Galloway, land of the foreigner. Someone's coming in there, suggests something's coming in. You also got Galston in Ayrshire, literally Gael, Galstown. So there is evidence for a foreign contribution to the Gaels, but that foreign contribution can only have come from this RL1065 because I know these two groups are long established in this area. The foreign input of DNA is only from this group here, RL1065. So let's look at this Indo-European group RL1065 that contributes to the Gaels. This is it here. And that's that little mutation there, RL1065. Now, you might remember this haplogroup tree because it was the branch from which Brendan's line originates. But what's interesting with Brendan's line is that I've got all these mutations all along here where I can track. I've got a lovely track, a record, and locations for Brendan's ancestors. But I don't have that mutation record of an ancestral journey for this RL1065 group, they've literally sort of appeared in southwest Scotland. Where do they come from? Now, since they carry the RDF13 mutation, they have to have come from somewhere else in Britain. They're not coming from continental Europe. They're coming from somewhere else within Britain. But where? So, I've mentioned Rome, so we have to go back. Rome changes everything. So Julius Caesar conquers Gaul between 58 and 50 BC. In his own words, he killed 1 million and enslaved 1 million. And he invaded Britain twice in 55 and 54 BC. And in his own words, this is what he says. In almost all the wars with the Gauls, succours had been furnished to our enemy from that country, it's in Britain, with fugitives from among the Gaelic Belgae fleeing to Belgic settlements in Britain. So southern Britain was Gaulish, or culturally Gaulish. And then the Roman conquest begins properly under Emperor Claudius in 43 AD. And the Roman occupation of Britain will last from 43 to 383 AD. So at the time of Julius Caesar, southern Britain was an extension of Gaul. And this is a little map showing the Gaelic tribes of Europe. And you can see it details, most notably, the Belgae in southern Britain. So southern Britain was inhabited by ancient Britons, they carrying that RDF13 mutation, who had been conquered / colonized by Gauls. And this is the tribes of southern Britain, or the tribes of Britain, the ancient Britain tribes, as described by Rome. So what we have a bunch of refugees who are culturally Gaulish being pushed from southern Britain into southwest Scotland, carrying their RL1065 mutation. So these guys, genetically they are ancient Britons, but culturally they are Gaulish. Now whether they're forcibly displaced and transplanted basically into southwest Scotland by the Romans as a sort of buffer, or whether they're refugees fleeing ahead of the Romans, I can't say for certain. So if we look at Roman Scotland now, what's interesting looking at this map is that the area of southwest Scotland associated with that's in this instance the ancestors of the Gaels, it's devoid of Roman settlement. So there's no roads, there's no settlements in southwest Scotland where the ancestors of the Gaels would emerge. So this was obviously this was maybe a problem area, but we don't know whether this RL1065 Gaulish ancient Britons are transplanted in here deliberately to sort of keep the natives in check, or whether they are themselves refugees from Rome who despise the Romans. So we have 3 different Y-DNA groups that make up the Gaels, okay? We have the Neolithic, IM223. We have the Indo-European Ancient Britons, M222. And we have the culturally Gaulish Southern Ancient Britons displaced willingly, I don't know, by Rome. And they carry that RL1065 marker into the southwest. So what percentage of males in Ireland and Scotland have a Gael Y-DNA signature, so carrying one of these 3 Gael markers, IM223, RM222, or RL1065. Now you can see in Ireland, they dominate the north. So here's this area here. In Scotland, it's the north, well, it's basically the west, basically, and northwest and southwest. Okay. Well, if you break down the numbers, it's basically 36% of Irish males, 35% of Scottish males. So just over a third of the male population of Ireland and Scotland are genetically Gaels. So now, as I mentioned, the Indo-Europeans, they dominate the Y-DNA signature of the Gaels. So who were the Indo-Europeans? And I need to tackle this in order to compare the origin of the story of the Gaels with their DNA. Now, basically, the Indo-Europeans are descended from the Yamnaya civilization. Who are the Yamnaya? So the Yamnaya, or the Proto-Indo-Europeans, emerged from the steppes of modern Ukraine and Russia between 3,300 and 2,600 BC. Now, although this image is in German, I like it because it illustrates everything that is, almost everything. What they're missing is cattle. So these guys are pastoralists, but they have mastered the wheel, they have wagons. They've also tamed the horse, and in time they'll be associated with chariots. But they are more mobile, and they're expanding with their herds of sheep and cattle across, west into Europe, but also east into Asia, most notably into India. But they are also a warrior culture. So they're bringing warfare, but they're also bringing disease. So it's reckoned that these guys spread plague into Europe for the first time, and that leads to a 90%. That combination of warfare and disease leads to a population replacement in Western Europe, in Europe, of 90%. Now, so although Ireland and maybe India have been separated by maybe 4,500 years, the links between Ireland and, say, India are quite remarkable, and they're actually explored in this book, Brehons and Brahmins. That's by Manchon McGann, who I mentioned earlier in this talk. So the links between both cultures, even though separated by 4,500 years, are quite remarkable, and I recommend that book. So this is the origin story of the Gaels as written by the Gaels themselves. And what's interesting is that they say that they came from Scythia. Where's Scythia? Scythia is literally the Indo-European heartland, where those Yamnaya folk lived in 3,300 BC. Okay, that's quite remarkable. So the knowledge was there. They knew of their origin. This is quite remarkable. They say they settled in Spain. Now, this took me a while. I was curious about this one. There's an explanation for the Spanish link, and I reckon this is like a little nod to the Neolithic component of the genetic makeup of the Gael, because the Neolithic, they're the first farmers. They're literally coming out of the Middle East and spreading along the Mediterranean coast into Spain, and then into Britain, and then into Ireland. And if you look today, the genetic signature of the first farmers, these Neolithics, is best represented by the Sardinians and the Basques. Okay, Basques are in Spain. So the Neolithic link is strongest today in the Basque country and in Sardinia. So this nod to Spain is probably acknowledgement of the Neolithic contribution to the DNA of the Gael. They come into possession of some provinces of the country. This is true because, as I've shown, they dominate. The Gael signature dominates almost all of Ulster, bits of Leinster, and almost all of Connacht. So again, that is true. Quite remarkable. Now, and they kept court. So this was their capital, was it at Aileach. Now where's Aileach? Well, you remember this map of the surnames of Northwest Ireland. We had the Ballymagowan here. This is Aileach. Aileach, denoted by this reconstructed monument, is in Northwest Ireland, and that's the area where this Gael M222 marker reaches its highest concentration in Ireland. Pretty remarkable. There's a lot of truth in here. So how do the Gaels describe themselves? Well, they describe themselves as a tall race of men with long skulls and yellow hair. Okay, is there any way to see if there's any truth in that? Well, I made the surnames of Ireland map a number of years ago. About 2 years ago, what I did was I translated all those surnames into their original Gaelic. The reason I've done that is because there's a lot of redundancy in our surnames, so you find that a lot of surnames in one area are actually just the anglicised versions of the same Gaelic surname. But what I did then was I back translated into English what each surname literally translates, or what each Irish surname literally translates to in English. Okay, and that gives me a little snapshot of the people of Ireland, a description of the people of Ireland at the time of, well, before the Norman conquests. So this is the original Gaelic. So if we look at Northwest Ireland, where we've been looking at previously, and if we look, we have all those surnames are in the original Gaelic, and if we translate them back into English, we get a description of the people. It's a fascinating description. And a lot of these surnames describe hair color. So we can look and see if all those surnames describing all the blonde and the fair-haired, the redheads, are they all found in the northern half of Ireland, predominantly in the northern half of Ireland, or are they just distributed evenly throughout the island? We can examine that. So, for example, these are the blondes. So here's some surnames that describe blonde people. Here's some surnames that describe the redheads. So fair-haired. And there's the brown-haired. And then we have the black-haired. Okay, so we can explore that now in more detail. So this map shows the distribution of those surnames that describe blonde-haired. And yes, they predominate in the northern half of the island, which is dominated by the Gael Y-DNA signature. It's pretty remarkable. But what about the redheads? Maybe it's a one-off. Let's look at the redheads. It's the same as true. Again, this is pretty remarkable. But what about the black and the brown haired? Is there any difference there? Maybe this is just, a coincidence. Well, no, because there's no difference in the distribution of brown-haired and black-haired compared to the fair-haired. So that description of the Gaels as themselves as fair-haired, yeah, there's something in that. And as I say, this is just the Y-DNA map showing you, yeah, their DNA signature dominates in the north, and those fair-haired people dominate in the north as well. So there is some truth in that statement too. Now, a couple of years ago, I discovered that there was a gigantism gene which is associated with Mid-Ulster, and it's pretty remarkable because this mutation is quite detrimental to your health, but yet this mutation has survived in this community of Mid-Ulster for thousands of years. Now, in this diagram here, you can see that the mutation itself is enriched. It's found in 1 in 150 people in Mid-Ulster compared to 1 in 2,000 in the rest of the island, even though it's detrimental to your health. So, in actual fact, there's actually a famous giant from the 17th century called Charles O'Byrne. He was born in Littlebridge, and which is in, I think it's in County Derry. And today, this is one such giant from mid-Ulster. He's a Dungannon man called Brendan Holland from the same area. And I think it was actually Brendan who instigated this study into mid-Ulster and the gigantism gene. Now, and if we look at the surnames of mid-Ulster, so there's Littlebridge and Dungannon, where two giants resided. We can look at the surrounding surnames, and is there any evidence in the surnames? Well, we have large, maybe. We have mighty people, maybe. We have strong man, yeah, maybe. But we've also the surname that translates as tall in this area, mid-Ulster. So, yeah, again, tall, fair-haired, coming from the steppes of Russia, all sorts of fits. Remarkably, it fits, which I was surprised. I have to admit, I was surprised. Yeah, so in the interest of balance, we got to look at Short. Okay, so just on the topic of traits. So Martin Short, I discovered Martin Short because I was watching Only Murders in the Building. And Martin Short, his character played someone of Irish descent who, at some point in the program, takes a DNA test, and they're always his co-actors are always joking in the program about how short he is. And I thought, okay, given this situation, test, Short surname, got to check this guy's history. Turns out his father was from Crossmaglen in South Armagh in Northern Ireland, who came to America during the Civil War. What's interesting is his surname translates as Macon-Gear, son of the short man. And if you look at the surnames of Armagh, you find Short. And you also find in place names, you find Shortstone, and Monagir, which is literally Short's Bog. So you think about it, this is a surname that's 1,000 years old. This guy, he's still short. The traits have still been, they're kept through the generations. So there's a lot of, as I say, that map showing what the people of Ireland were like, that snapshot is quite remarkable and quite accurate. So we get the summary of the Gael. So in this talk, one thing I hope to illustrate is how the history of the Irish and Scots is intricately linked, okay? And that for the Gael, the Indo-European Y-DNA signature dominates, okay? But there is a significant contribution of Neolithic DNA. And also, a major fact in this is the Gaulish conquest and colonization of southern Britain, and then the subsequent Roman conquests, which changed basically the genetic makeup of Ireland and Scotland. The Gaels we know now emerged from southwest Scotland, and as I mentioned, they are a mix of RDF 13 Indo-Europeans, so natives of southwest Scotland with some Gaul-like settlers, refugees from southern Britain, plus that Neolithic input. So the Gaels are basically, the Irish Gaels are basically a bunch of invaders from southwest Scotland who colonized the north of Ireland around 1600 AD. Oops, I mean 200 AD. So if you know a bit of Irish history, you'll probably understand that little mistake there, because those in the north of Ireland, regardless of their background, are pretty similar. Anyway, so there is also a remarkable similarity between the origin story and description of the Gael and their DNA story. That surprised me. Honest to God, I was completely surprised. And although they represent a significant minority, 1/3 of the male population of Ireland and Scotland, they dominate the identity today of the Irish and Scots. So, if I was to summarize this story in a sentence, I'd say basically the Gaels are a mix of Indo-Europeans, think Eurasian steppe, Yamnaya, and Neolithic, think forest farmers, and today represented by the Middle East, Basque and Sardinians. It's that DNA with Gaulish language and cultural contributions, and all because of the Romans. Now, Another story of this, since they represent a significant minority, is why did the Gaels come to dominate the identity of Ireland and Scotland? And I suspect, can't prove, I suspect it's because of Christianity. And that's another story, another YouTube. Now, at the start of this talk, I showed a little bottle of Guinness and I didn't explain the context. But this research I've done, it all sort of began with this paper that was published in 2006, which was entitled Y Chromosomes and the Extent of Patrilineal Ancestry in Irish Surnames, and it was in Human Genetics. And Patrick Guinness, this guy here, he is the direct descendant of Arthur Guinness, the brewing family. And he funded this research, this paper, he part-funded this research with Professor Dan Bradley at Trinity College, Dublin. And only it was because Patrick wanted to know the origin of his Guinness ancestors. Now it turns out that Patrick, his Guinness ancestors are this group, this Neolithic group of the Gael, while Dan Bradley's are this RN222 group of the Gael. And it turns out that Patrick's Guinness ancestors are the McGuinness of County Down. And they come to dominate parts of modern County Down. And if you look at the townlands in County Down, there is actually a Guinness townland. There's a place called Guinness. So this research, as I say, all began with this paper that was published in 2006. So all of these maps and data and haplogroup trees that I've illustrated here are free to browse on this originsmaps.com website. You just simply click on maps or click on haplogroup trees and then click on the map you want to view, and then you place the cursor over the area of interest to magnify it. Now for the museum, we're about to install this little kiosk, which when you come to the museum, you will be able to look for your Irish surname. You'll find its origin where it appears on the Irish Origins map, and you'll find any associated place names, castles that we have identified in the research. Okay, so in the interest of balance, remember I mentioned finally that I would discuss about the females. So you can explore your direct maternal line, and you do that through mitochondrial mtDNA testing, because that mitochondria is only passed from mother to her offspring. But there's a problem. There's far less DNA to work with compared to Y-DNA, and you need to do full sequence mtDNA testing, which is more expensive. So in order for me to work with an mtDNA result, I need to see a full sequence mtDNA results. Problem is there's no link with the land or surname. So pinpointing maternal Eve or maternal origin requires a different approach. So how do you do it? Well, basically you would full sequence mtDNA test females from all over Ireland, so from maybe 10 females from each county in Ireland, and that would give you a database from which you would come with your mtDNA results, submitted, and you see which of those females in Ireland you match. You might find you only match the ladies from Donegal, and that would give you your Irish maternal origin. Now, the female line, in my humble opinion, is probably far more stable, and it's probably overwhelmingly older, potentially Neolithic in origin, maybe with a bit of Stone Age maternal DNA, I don't know. And the reason for that is because the groups that came, the Indo-European groups that come in 2500 BC, and then any later groups like the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, they're warriors, and they're not taking their wives, and they usually marry the local girls. So I reckon the female story, There may not even be any Gaelic female DNA in Ireland. It may be all Neolithic. But I reckon the female story will be potentially more interesting. And that just remains for me to thank you for bearing with me. If you have any questions, you can email me at tyronebowes.com, or you can contact me via my website at Irish Origins, Scottish Origins, Origins Maps, or you can reach out via Facebook, and of course I'll also post this video on YouTube, and you can post any questions on YouTube and I will answer them to the best of my ability. So thank you.